Now, the coronavirus and the resulting lockdown have had a devastating impact on employment in the country, as well as the prospects of finding new jobs. With job losses and wage cuts all round, people who are able to hold onto their jobs will likely now have very little bargaining power in the workplace. So the question is the working class suffering a crisis, and what power does it still have? These are just some of the issues that the South African Communist Party's Jeremy Cronin is tackling at the Oliver Tambo School of Leadership. He joins us now to unpack some of these big questions on the line. Jeremy, good morning. Thanks so much for coming on to the AM report. What an incredibly different world, specifically for the working class, that we're facing now compared to just 3 months ago.
Yes, good morning, Michelle, and thanks for having me on the show. Well, yes, it's true. It's become incredibly difficult, but although we shouldn't forget that even before the COVID crisis broke and before lockdowns and so on, it was crisis times for many, many working people in South Africa. I mean, we had these world record levels of unemployment, 38, 39%, if one counts those who are looking for work but can't get it as well. And now, economists are predicting that we are going to see perhaps a doubling of those unemployment level figures. So it's a crisis on top of a crisis, basically, for millions and millions of working people here in South Africa, but also around the world, including in some of the most developed economies.
I mean, it's difficult to imagine what you're explaining there, Jeremy, that our unemployment numbers may well double in the coming months in South Africa, given the crisis, as you say, we were already in pre-COVID-19. But I guess the question is, do you think that this could be a period of real economic renewal for South Africa, that this might actually pose an opportunity for our country?
Yeah, no, I think that's a brilliant question, and I think that's exactly, it has to be that. I mean, we can't go back to the crisis before the crisis. And I think, again, around the world, people are asking this question, and we've really got to reset. We've got to have a major, major reset. I mean, I think we've accomplished good things as a country since, post-apartheid, since 1994. But we haven't fundamentally changed many of the structures that we've inherited from the apartheid and colonial past. And we've really got to now use this very grave situation to rethink, to be honest, to be self-critical in constructive ways, and really to move forward. But what does that mean? Well, I don't think I mean, first of all, I think you're right in the sense, obviously, with growing unemployment, it weakens to some extent the leverage of workers. But on the other hand, I mean, what we're seeing is evidence of also, given in the midst of the COVID pandemic, what we're seeing is that workers, bosses are very keen to get workers back to work, obviously, so that they can make a profit out of production and of sales. But workers now are also asserting their right to have a democratic decision-making around the safety of the workplace, whether health conditions are appropriate and so on. We've seen that around the opening of schools, where the unions across the board, despite divisions that there might be between those different federations, different unions in the education sector, have come together in a united way to say, yes, we also want to get back to school. Yes, we see we have an important role to play. But at the same time, we are not just going to be marched back to school. And we're seeing the same on the mines. We're seeing the same in many other workplaces. So I think that's one important aspect. And I think what the crisis has reminded us of is how much we depend on the working class as a country, and including often forgotten or marginalized work. For instance, refuse collectors. Suddenly we realize how that's essential work in a situation like this. It might not be highly regarded or very well paid at all, but it's essential work. So part of the reset also needs to be, what is it that is valuable by way of work? What is productive and useful work, and what isn't? Because I think a lot of well-paid jobs, advertising, which probably earns Newsroom Africa some of its money, but nonetheless, I mean, advertising by and large, I mean, how useful is that to our society? So I think we need to rethink what is useful and not. Yeah.
And Jeremy, I mean, given what you're just saying, that we now have, and this is taking place in the world at the moment, we're rethinking just exactly which sectors are more important and the most important to keep our country going during the time like a pandemic. But how is the SACP perhaps steering conversations within the alliance as we begin to look towards what a post-COVID South African economy would look like?
Yeah, so exactly. And clearly what we need is a major boost to the economy. We need to have a significant investment. And the big question comes, well, where is the money? And part of our big argument as the SACP, but not just the SACP alone, is to say that there are significant resources inside of our country, domestic resources. A lot of it gets lost through illicit and sometimes licit capital exports, capital flight out of our country. I saw one academic research which suggested, I think it was in 2011, that something like 20% of our GDP was lost through capital flight, some of it legal going, others going to tax havens, and all kinds of things happening like that. So we need to exert much greater and much more effective capital control of the resources, money, capital that is produced here in South Africa. So that is one thing we've got to look at. We need to also look at the resources that are inside of the country in terms of retirement funds and other things. We need to use those for a significant stimulus package. One of the big advantages we've got as South Africa, I mean, a lot has been spoken about, particularly before the COVID crisis broke, that that we had this terrible debt. Now, it's true that we have got a public debt, but the great advantage we've got compared to many other countries, Argentina comes to mind, but many others, is that our debt is largely rand denominated. So it's not dollar denominated, which means that we don't have to depend on losing our sovereignty by going to international borrowing, financial institutions. At least as much as possible, we need to avoid that so that we hold on to our ability to resource our own country with our own resources, including using the Reserve Bank. The Reserve Bank says, it can't do quantitative easing, but it did it a month and a half ago. Something like 250 billion it printed out of thin air and pumped into the for-profit commercial banks to ensure that they had their liquidity, continued liquidity. Now, one of the questions we're asking is, why don't you put that money more directly into the Industrial Development Corporation, for instance, so that rather than go through commercial banks who will then use the loans that they're getting from the Reserve Bank, money created out of thin air, to turn a profit basically as banks through loaning on, obviously at a higher price, including to the public sector. Why don't we directly fund the public sector? Obviously, in doing that, we need to make sure that there's not state capture, that there's not a waste of resources and so on. But so those are some of the proposals that we're making, that we need a major infrastructure build program, for instance, which focuses particularly on maintenance and on a just green transition. So those are some of the ideas that we're floating into the alliance, and I must say that there's quite considerable positive reception from our alliance partners and more broadly.
And I suppose, we all think about when we look back at how better we could have been prepared for COVID-19. Hindsight is always 20/20 vision, but you talk about one of the proposals being a major infrastructure build. The discussion, take us into some of the discussions around how much better prepared we may have been when COVID-19 hit, if we had things like proper sanitation, running water, proper housing for people to quarantine when they needed to. Are those discussions happening? The sort of regret that we weren't better prepared, that we weren't in a better position, because we are doing relatively well. If we look at institutions like the World Health Organization, they've time and time again lauded South African government for how well the pandemic is being handled, how early we locked down. How much better would we have been doing if we had all of the other things in place?
Yes, no, I think that the World Health Organization has been right, that I think that President Ramaphosa, quite rightly, and in contrast, sharp contrast, with some leading figures in the US or Brazil or even in the UK, that I think that there was good leadership in moving quickly and effectively and communicating relatively well about the importance of lockdown. But I think that, our particular conditions meant that although there was an early move in the correct direction, the problem is that given the housing crisis that we've got, the fact that millions of people are in informal settlements or in townships that are overcrowded and bursting to the seams, it means that in practice, although the lockdown was the right move to make, it was impossible to sustain for a huge number of South Africans. And that revealed something to us, which we knew already, but it brought it out very starkly, what we've done, by and large, with good intentions, has been to repeat apartheid spatial patterns in our cities, so that these 3 million, nearly 4 million RDP houses that we've built are in the same distant locations, typically the same matchbox houses, the same often unsanitary conditions and so forth. So we built houses, but not necessarily viable communities. And that then has exposed the next challenge of the legacy of apartheid space, is that for the working class to get to work, or for students to get from townships into universities and to other facilities and resources, they travel on overcrowded and dangerous, for that matter, minibus taxis. So the whole vector along which clearly now the infection, the pandemic is traveling, is compounded by these untransformed realities in our society, and I think which we knew existed. But I think, again, it presses upon us the imperative of having serious land reform, not just rural land reform, but urban land reform, so that people are much better located, so that people can easily access work and so forth. And it makes sense from an economic point of view as well, just in terms of the cost to families of travel, but also the productivity with which workers, arrive at work. If you're getting up at 4 in the morning in order to get to work and have to catch too many minibus taxis, you're not going to be extremely productive either at work.
No, absolutely. Jeremy, unfortunately we've run out of time, but thanks so much for highlighting some of those important discussions that no doubt government will be having in the weeks and months, years to come as well. Jeremy Cronin is with the South African Communist Party. He's tackling some of those issues at the Oliver Tambo School of Leadership.